This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning the show is Elliott Dennis, University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist, with an update on feeder cattle, live cattle, missed reports, settled lawsuits, and if consumers are still buying beef. K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken continues today's show discussing leaves in ponds and the issues they can create for aquatic life and livestock. A Wheat Scoop feature from Kansas Wheat's Gordon Clark ends the show as he highlights research taking place at K-State that is looking into reducing gluten allergens in wheat. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. Elliott, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Elliott, what are we seeing for the feeder cattle, especially as we look at Nebraska?
Markets have kind of continued to kind of rock and roll. They did take a little bit setback in the beginning of October, but they've really rebounded since then. Most of the 5-6 weights, are somewhere in the realm of 448 to the 501 dollars per hundredweight. So still on steers. I mean, we're still pretty strong. Just the sales that are going through, we still have quite a bit of volume starting to happen and pick up as people are beginning to wean. So really kind of continues to support the idea that markets can kind of continue to trend higher as long as we kind of continue to have strong demand from consumers being pulled down.
You mentioned a setback at the beginning of this month, and what caused that?
Yeah, I think there was just markets were kind of in a lull right now. Some of that had to do with some of the supply situation, kind of figuring it out. Some of the government shutdown and kind of the idea of, where the prices are going to be reported. A lot of those prices had kind of backed off, and then the individual market reports have really picked up. We started to realize, where can we start to get information if there's not publicly reported data. And so I think we've kind of sorted through some of those issues in the market, and now we're able to kind of pick back up where we left off.
What are we seeing for live cattle?
Yeah, live cattle was really the exciting thing that happened this week. Supplies, once again, are still tight, almost in Nebraska, in the 240 range on the live weight. And really, could we have gone a little bit higher given where the futures market was trading at, particularly early or middle of the week? Given that just kind of where the basis was at, we probably could have gone a little bit higher, but really strong underlying fundamentals as far as the cash market. Now, the futures market had a little bit of I would say kind of a hiccup towards the end of the week, really kind of broke technicals going into Thursday. Everyone was really tracking contract records. And then on Friday, had a kind of an announcement from President Trump that came out saying that they were going to do something in the beef complex. That kind of really sent the market in kind of a downspin. A lot of that was algorithmic trading that kind of captures headlines and then they trade on it. And so essentially what that would mean, given kind of Trump's background, would be something to do with trade. There's a lot of speculation about kind of, is it going to be bringing more Argentinian beef? Do we relax kind of some of our trading relationships with Brazil to bring in more beef? Because we know a lot of that demand for beef right now is coming in the form of kind of grind or kind of ground beef. And then there was kind of even some chatter about, do we buy, fat cattle that's in boxes from Mexico? So I think that's generally where the market was at, and it was really put the market in a tough position, just down across the board, all contracts.
So as you mentioned, that announcement from our executive branch, is that something that's actually happening or just talk about something that might happen?
Yeah, this is still just chatter, wouldn't say it's a formal announcement. The announcement was, tweeted out by President Trump saying that something big was going to happen. Something big did happen as far as kind of the reaction to it. And really that they're really targeting kind of this price of beef. But we kind of go back to what Secretary Rollins had talked about earlier in the month when they were this first thing came out that the federal government was going to kind of do something about it. And the real argument was that she said nothing is going to be done in the form of direct payments to producers. Everything that they have planned on are focusing on kind of opening up working lands to grazing and really expanding risk mitigation tools. So when you think about in other sectors, kind of where we've seen that happen, we've seen kind of coal development in Utah kind of open up, kind of releasing federal lands for kind of natural resource development. Could you see something like that happen on federal land grazing? We already have BLM forest land, but do we increase allocations in that space? And we think about risk mitigation tools, RMA, subsidy levels potentially could change there. That's one of the levers that they have. But really, when we think about the suite of risk management tools that producers have, we pretty much have the full array of tools, at least now with the introduction of wingcast risk protection that's available in a select number of states. So whether that gets rolled out in other states, I think those are the types of things that they're talking about rather than kind of regulatory changes. So really at the end of the last week, it was more of kind of a sit and wait. Normally when we've kind of hit these corrections with high momentum, high relative strength, we've broken the resistance on the Bollinger Bands for the technicals. Normally it's the 2 or 3 days that we start to kind of trade sideways or a little bit down, and then the markets can pick back up.
When you say releasing federal land, what do you mean by that?
In certain locations in the United States, you can't actually have mineral development because it's under federal land. And so when they talk about, at least in kind of the oil and gas space, they're talking about allowing drilling to happen or development of minerals that we know is out there to kind of help increase supply. Currently with like the Forest Service and other national basically properties, we have the ability to graze it under basically contracts. Those are based upon AUMs. Those AUMs are then allocated and competitively bid on, but really can be passed down. And so kind of in this context of expanding, like could we expand more lands that have the ability to graze on under those, or do we expand AUMs, number of AUMs that can be out there? But really, once again, is this going to change the underlying fundamentals of supply? No, not really. It may be create incentives to say like, well, we don't have enough land to graze. If we open up more grazing land, that's going to be many, many years before we experience the benefits of it, not the short term, higher prices we're paying at the store by consumers.
Elliot, we've mentioned the government shutdown. Are there any reports that you feel like we're missing in the cattle market that could be beneficial or even provide information that's important?
Yeah, this is kind of really the one that has really hit us this week was the CFTC Commitment of Traders report. This is kind of shows where everyone's positions is, long, shorts, managed money, and managed money was sitting in a particular position that when these kind of down change started happening, kind of through the chatter that they were kind of liquidating their positions. We don't know that for sure because we don't have those commitment of traders reports. So I think some of that information that we use to kind of understand kind of where movements are coming, where is money flow happening, we're just kind of blind right now. And so I think that is one example of kind of the impacts of a report that we're unable to replicate. And so a lot of it's just kind of through informal conversations, but nothing that's really, I guess, permanent from the government. And that's why I think even though we might realize that we can do a lot of things potentially without the government, but there's a lot of things that the government provides as like a public service that really help the economy run and move and for really markets to have transparency.
Have there been any other big pieces of news in the cattle market or livestock industry?
Really, when we're talking about kind of the wholesale market, the packers that keep getting hammered, higher live cattle prices that they're having to pay. Boxes are really following the futures and cash is really leading the way from on the live cattle there. But really kind of the big thing that came out towards the end of the week was these settlements. Over the last, 3 or 4 years, we've heard the smaller groups of producers start to litigate against some of the major packers, Tyson, Cargill, JBS, National Beef. All of the major packers have some sort of lawsuit against them, basically accusing them of conspiring to inflate beef prices during really COVID-19 and a little bit earlier than that. But two of these were settled this past week, in addition to the one that was settled by JBS earlier. Tyson Foods and Cargill basically agreed to pay about $88 million collectively to settle those lawsuits. Now, this is basically payment without admission of wrongdoing. And so they're settling this outside of out of court. And so that's kind of combined. The one with national beef is still ongoing. But this kind of that was the major thing that was kind of hitting the market that they were kind of sorting out in the beginning, and something that was certainly a piece of legislation that the Biden administration was really kind of pushing, which was kind of this competitive markets, really trying to prevent monopolies and basically manipulative pricing. That was a huge thing that they were pushing in there, and some of these have kind of started to conclude now that they've been in kind of litigation for the last 3 or 4 years.
Are our customers and consumers still wanting the beef?
Yeah, beef demand is at an all-time high. Really, when we started tracking beef demand since early 2000, when we started developing these indices, we're at the highest levels that we've ever experienced, and really by a long shot, both in Q1, Q2, and now heading into the finishing up the Q3. Like, we've had record demand, and really what we see is that beef tends to be a high feature item. People, when they're spending their basket of goods. Beef is a huge value of that, and retailers know that. They're featuring beef at all-time levels, and consumers are continuing to pay higher prices, and that's why we're seeing kind of that demand go up. When we think about kind of relative prices, we think they can buy different either beef or they can buy pork. Consumers are continuing to buy beef products, even though there are alternative substitutes, and really what that we call that elasticity, how price sensitive people are. But they've really shown some resilience that, I think kind of entering kind of these different phases of potentially of kind of where demand is and how much substitution actually happens amongst consumers.
Elliott, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was University of Nebraska at Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about leaves with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Joe, talking about leaves, and why does that matter when we think about ponds and water?
Yeah, we're at the time of the year where we're starting to see changes in the color of leaves, and leaves are starting to fall off the trees. And a lot of times they fall off and we don't really think about them other than maybe we have to rake them all up out of our yard, right? But leaves can cause a lot of issues in waterways, and so I thought they'd be fun to chat about today.
Is nutrients or an oversupply of nutrients one of the issues they can create?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about nutrients in the past and the effects that can have on the aquatic ecosystems. And so leaves can bring with them a lot of nutrients. Phosphorus, they're a big input source of phosphorus. The fancy word that scientists use is allochthonous input, which just means it's coming from the environment outside of the pond. But we're bringing those nutrients into the pond or into the waterway that we have. And so adding those nutrients can cause issues like excessive algae growth, which I know is a concern for a lot of people that have ponds throughout the state. It can cause oxygen levels. And so when we have buildup of this organic layer, you can start to see issues with the amount of oxygen in the water, and that can start to drop. That can cause issues for critters. One of the big things that we see is, over time, if these leaves are falling into the same area in a pond or a waterway, they tend to break down in that area slowly, but you can get a layer of thick pond sludge or pond muck, which is like a really dark, stinky substance that gets on the bottom of the pond, just is accumulating that organic material over time, and it becomes an anoxic environment without oxygen. When that happens, it gets, like I said, really stinky. It's easy to walk out in your pond and kind of sink down in it. So just not a pleasant thing to have in your pond.
Does it matter what type of leaves or trees those leaves are falling off of, or is this an issue for all tree leaves?
Yeah, there's a little bit of a difference in the nutrient loading of the types of leaves that we have, but really it comes down to the amount of leaves that are entering the waterway. And so all leaves are going to have some sort of nutrients. There's going to be differences in the types of nutrients they have, but this is going to be a ubiquitous problem. All leaves are going to add to this type of problem in a pond setting.
And so when you mentioned stinky ponds, and is this leaves blowing in from different trees, or is it a tree being right over the pond, or do they both create issues?
Yeah, both of those things are going to happen. You can have a bunch of trees right around your pond that are dropping in. One of the things that I think is overlooked is that, there could be leaves that are, half a mile away that are in the watershed along a creek. And when we get a big rainfall event, that creek might fill up and it might bring with it those leaves into the pond or bring them downstream into the river. So it's important to remember that, when we have high flow events, that storm water, that water is bringing more than just water through the watershed. So it can pick up chemicals or nutrients from fertilizer applications or herbicide, pesticide applications to a field. It can bring with it dirt, which can fill in our pond, or it could bring with it leaves or other natural materials that can cause some of these pond muck or pond sludge issues we're talking about.
Do we have to worry about leaves in things like creeks or really just stagnant bodies of water?
So, Mother Nature does a really good job of nutrient cycling. And so taking the leaves or the material that we have and kind of breaking it down naturally. But so a little bit of leaves piling up in a creek could be a natural thing. And you might have things like crayfish in there, or, there's some really big invertebrates that can cut the big leaves into smaller pieces and those can break down. And so some leaves in the right environment are beneficial. But in a creek, that water is flowing. That's something that we would expect to kind of occur over time. In a pond where they can collect, or in a river where we have a lot of runoff moving, all collecting and moving to one area, that's when we can start to see problems. So I'm not going to say it's not a problem around creeks, but it's a less common problem around creeks than it would be around ponds for sure.
And you mentioned that sometimes that can create some extra sludge in the bottom of ponds with leaves and reduce the volume of water in a pond. Is that something that then producers might need to clean out?
Yeah, so that's the sedimentation process. And so over time, ponds are going to fill in. If they're bringing a lot of nutrients and a lot of sediment with them into the pond, that's going to cause your pond to fill in over time. And that's definitely something you're going to manage. It's going to reduce the amount of lifespan that your pond has. And so you might need to do something like dredge out your pond more often. If you're bringing in a lot of material through the watershed, you might need to drain out your pond or dredge out your pond more often. If you have a lot of leaves from trees right around your pond, filling it in. So all of those things can be issues. When you're talking about pond muck and pond sludge, we've been talking primarily about issues with oxygen and issues with plants, but it can also be a concern for livestock. And so this pond sludge is at the bottom of the pond, and if you walk out into a pond that has it, it's almost like quicksand. So you'll sink into it really quickly. It'll kind of grab onto you and be hard to move. Most of the time, people are pretty good at getting out of those situations, but livestock that might have access to that pond could wander in and their legs might get stuck. They might start to sink down into that pond muck or pond sludge. And I have seen livestock that have been trapped, exhausted themselves, and drowned because of a buildup of pond muck or pond sludge. So there are some real concerns for producers throughout the state when we're thinking about, something that seems kind of harmless, like leaves washing into a tree over time, can turn into a dangerous situation.
Is this something that producers need to go check their ponds for or put on a cycle? What's the best way of making sure that they aren't accidentally creating a hazardous environment for their livestock?
Yeah, I think that a lot of times it's just going out and being around your pond, right? We've talked about that before. So, if your pond kind of smells funky, if it has a lot of vegetation on it, if you take a step or two out into the pond and you start to sink down and the substrate's really, really dark black color, a lot of times you'll see bubbles come up when you step in. So it will release methane gas that the bacteria are producing as part of their digestion process. That breakdown of that more material can cause a lot of these issues. And so, it's something that you might see when you're out at your pond. If you're around it, there are steps you can take to mitigate it. If it gets really bad, you might need to dig out your pond or dredge out your pond. Things like aeration might be beneficial. There are some natural bacteria that you can add to your pond. There are steps you can take. If that's something you'd want to do, I'd definitely recommend you reach out to your local extension agent or to me, and we could get you more information on how to properly manage that situation that you might experience.
If ideally we don't want too many leaves in our ponds, What should we do with the leaves, or what are some options?
Yeah, that's going to kind of depend on where you're at. And so, a lot of urban settings, a lot of cities have fall pickup days where they'll come around and they'll pick up leaves that you've collected in biodegradable bags. And then they'll take those and they'll make compost. A lot of times that's available to the citizens of the city itself. So it's a cycle that can be really beneficial. If you have the space and you can make a compost pile with some of these leaves, that's really beneficial. It's going to break down those same nutrients that would be turning into pond sludge or feeding plants in our pond could then, be used to feed our gardens, for example. So there might be some benefits where we can make a circle, and instead of the leaves being a problem, they're turning into a benefit for us. One of the things that's really common is to mulch up your leaves. And so if you have a yard and there's not a ton of leaves, you can simply drive over them with your lawnmower, break them down into little pieces. And that has a lot of benefits for the turf grass too. And so if you do something like that, you're going to see benefits like adding those nutrients back to your lawn, which can make your lawn fuller. It can make your grass greener. So there can be a lot of benefits there. It can help retain moisture. And so make sure that your pond is getting plenty of moisture throughout both the dormant season and the early growing season in the spring. So there can be lots of benefits to adding these leaves or chopping them up and adding them back to your lawn system.
Joe, as we wrap up today's conversation, is just a few leaves in a pond fine, or how many leaves is too many leaves in a pond?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like I mentioned earlier, animals like crayfish, or there are invertebrates called shredders that like to go take big leaves and break them into smaller pieces. And those are really important parts of the aquatic ecosystem. And so we want to encourage certain invertebrates, certain crayfish in our pond ecosystem. It helps to make it, just more fulfilling and a better ecological environment. Some leaves can also provide habitat. And so habitat for small fish, they can provide habitat for salamanders that might be found in the pond. So there can be some benefits to some leaves. I think, what tends to happen is we tend to get an area in our pond that just becomes covered with a thick layer. And so if you have a few leaves that are kind of scattered around your pond, or you have, a couple areas that are maybe an inch deep with leaves, that's probably going to be okay. If you start to get areas where it accumulates really thick and there's big piles of leaves that, then you can't get oxygen to that whole pile and it can't all be broken down. That's when it would turn into that anoxic environment. We'd start to see the issues with the pond muck and pond sludge.
Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me back.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show with a Kansas wheat scoop feature as we listen to Gordon Clark explain work that is being done by Kansas State University researchers and this state's farmers about reducing gluten in wheat.
Kansas State University researchers and the state's farmers are putting their collective support behind a project to reduce the allergency of gluten in wheat, while maintaining the grain's ability for bread and other products. Edward Oknov, a university distinguished professor in K-State's Department of Plant Pathology, says his team is identifying proteins in the wheat genome that trigger allergic reactions in people with celiac disease. The autoimmune disorder causes the immune system to react abnormally to gluten, a protein found in wheat, rye, and barley. Once they find the problematic proteins, researchers will use a gene editing technique known as CRISPR-Cas9 to target changes in the genome, which they hope will reduce or eliminate the allergic response in future varieties grown by U.S. wheat producers. According to the Celiac Disease Foundation, the disorder affects 1 in 100 people worldwide, including about 2 million Americans. The foundation notes that when people with the disease eat gluten, their immune system attacks the small intestine, damaging the small finger-like villi that help absorb nutrients. Our dilemma in doing this work, Oknov said, is that in the past we have successfully reduced immunotoxicity in wheat by suppressing the expression of gluten-encoding genes. but in most cases inevitably leads to the reduction of bread-making quality of that wheat. We are working to develop wheat varieties that have lower abundance of gluten proteins that cause allergic reactions, while at the same time maintaining bread-making quality. The 3-year project began earlier this year and is funded by a $990,000 grant from the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. Project partners include K-State, University of California, Davis, the California Wheat Commission, the Celiac Disease Foundation, and Kansas Wheat. Globally, the world is now consuming more than 800 million metric tons of wheat. In 2023, K-State reported a breakthrough in developing wheat-based foods that contain lower amounts of gluten while maintaining the quality of flour for baking. The current study will build on that work, further investigating the precise proteins that trigger gluten allergies. Oknov said gluten will never likely be completely removed from wheat since it is important for bread making. Gluten provides the texture, flavor, and moisture in such products as bread, bagels, pastries, noodles, and more. We all know the benefits that whole grains play in a balanced diet, and yet there is a segment of the population that is trying to avoid those due to risk of an allergic reaction, Gilpin said. This is research that addresses a specific consumer need. It's particularly positive for the wheat industry and more specifically wheat farmers. It's exciting to have Kansas State as a partner on this project. For Kansas Wheat, this is Gordon Clark.
Once again, that was part of Kansas Wheat's Wheat Scoop feature with Gordon Clark discussing reducing gluten in wheat. If you'd like to check out other things from Kansas Wheat or more Wheat Scoop features, you can do so by heading over to their website, ksre.ksu.edu. Again, that is ksre.ksu.edu. You can also find them linked on K-State Extension's website, which is ksre.ksu.edu. I will, of course, link both of those in today's show notes on agtoday.net. If you are on the Extension website, you can find a lot of other resources also available to you. One of them includes other radio features, including the Kansas Profile, Milk Lines, and Plantorama. While you're there are multiple other things you can also find, including news releases, volunteer opportunities, where your local extension office is, and other programming that is also available. Of course, once again, you can find all of this on ksre.ksu.edu's website. There are a few other extension websites which you can easily navigate to, one of them being the Department of Agronomy's eUpdates, which is eUpdate.agronomy.ksu.edu, K-State's Beef Extension Team, which is ksubeef.org, or K-State Extension's Swine Team, which is ksuswine.org. All these web addresses will be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.